Everyone. My name is Dr. Nicole Freeman. I'm the Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach. On behalf of the Holocaust Memorial, I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight for our second lecture in our three-part series on Jewish women's experiences during the Holocaust. Before we begin, I just have to say a few thank yous to the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, the Florida Department of Education, the City of Miami Beach Cultural Affairs Program, Cultural Arts Council, and the State of Florida Department of State Division of Arts and Culture. Thank you for all of your help and for making this lecture series possible. So tonight's program is a conversation between Dr. Zoe Waxman and Dr. Michael Berenbaum. So Dr. Michael Berenbaum is the director of the Ziggy Zirig Institute and professor of Jewish Studies at the American Jewish University, and he will introduce Dr. Waxman.
Okay, first of all, I guess it's good afternoon or good early evening in Miami. Both Professor Waxman and I are speaking to you from England. I'm en route to Auschwitz tomorrow, where in a very interesting way, I'm taking 10 attorney generals of the United States for a crash course on anti-Semitism to Poland. And we stopped in London en route to break up the trip. We have a very special pleasure today, and I have a very particular pleasure, which is that I have read Zoe Waxman's work. She's written brilliantly on women in the Holocaust. I have reviewed her work. I have never met her, and we've never had a direct dialogue. So I figured that as we were developing this three-session part on women in the Holocaust, why shouldn't I avail myself the opportunity to speak to one of the leading authorities and also, in a wonderful way, one of the younger generation of scholars working in this field. And that's the reason that she's here. She is a departmental lecturer in modern Jewish history at the Oriental Institute. She's written on the Holocaust, on gender and genocide, on memory and trauma history. And her work has been on women in the Holocaust and also rape and sexual abuse in genocide with the Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles. If you want to read one book on women in the Holocaust, I recommend her book very strongly. It does so many things so right that it's really serves both as a basic introduction, as a critique, as a reflection, and in all sorts of ways. So not spending so much time introducing Zoe, we're going to begin by asking you, Zoe, how did you get, and I could call you Professor Waxman, but let's presume.
No, please, no.
Let's presume first names, because I'm, the more titles I get, the less formal I become. And besides that, if anybody calls me with a title, my wife says, Professor, would you bring out the, would you please take out the garbage and do the dishes? So we all have to accept a measure of humility. So tell us a little bit about your work, and also a little bit about where the field is at this point, and what we understand and what we still don't understand.
Well, I first began, thank you very much, I should say, for a very incredibly kind introduction from someone I've long admired. So thank you so much. And it's a real honor and a pleasure to be speaking to you tonight. I first became interested in the subject of women in the Holocaust in the 1990s as a graduate student. And I have to say, my interest started from a very simple premise that I just wanted to find out about more about women's experiences during the Holocaust. I wanted to find out how they were different from men's experiences and the particularities of women's experiences. And increasingly, I found myself enraged because there was nothing on women's Holocaust experiences, and men's experiences were taken as normative, as if the Holocaust was about men. So I set about reading women's testimonies and just trying to find out simply about their lives. And from the very start, I was determined not to create a hierarchy of suffering. I wasn't trying to show that one gender suffered more, but just that people suffered differently. I mean, we're all, I think, in everyday life, we can acknowledge that our experiences are coloured by age, ethnicity, religion, gender, social and economic class. So I think it's very important when you're exploring an event as enormous and diverse as the Holocaust, to look at how people's experiences might be different in different places and according to who they are.
I think you made a very important point, which is that if you create a hierarchy of suffering, you're really diminishing people's suffering. And and the other part of suffering that's really distinct is suffering is personal.
Yes.
And consequently, if you have a stomach ache, it doesn't help me. It doesn't help you to tell you that I have a toothache, unless I can reach out with empathy. So let's cut to the second question then. What did you find was distinct or unique about the way in which women were persecuted? And I guess the second half of that is the way in which the women endured their persecution.
Those are two really good questions. Firstly, women were targeted and persecuted as childbearers or potential childbearers. In other words, they were specifically targeted as mothers or potential mothers of a future Jewish race. So their position was unique. At the same time, I should say that men were the first to be persecuted and murdered, particularly Orthodox Jewish men, because not only were they most visible, they were also seen as potential political opponents. But nevertheless, we saw quite quickly, because of this, that ghettos became female-dominated. So women were responsible, particularly because men couldn't be seen outside during daytime hours for fear of deportation. So women became increasingly responsible for their families, both in terms of earning money and also looking after their families. So I think, and at least initially, women in a way found they were having to act in all sorts of unanticipated ways. And there was, in a sense, a reversal of gendered roles. But of course, with deportation from the ghettos and internment in the concentration camps, this changed. But I think what's particularly interesting to follow is that even at deportation, women were specifically persecuted because of their gender. Any woman accompanying children under the age of 14 was sentenced to death. Any women accompanying aged parents were sentenced to death. So gender mattered, and it mattered right till the end. And that isn't to create a hierarchy of suffering, but it's just to say, as is famously been said, on the way to the gas chambers, people suffered differently.
Let's talk about the unique roles that women played within the, before, not as victims, but really as agents and as activists in the process, before we speak solely about victimization.
Well, I think what's particularly interesting is that there was beginning to be a change of gendered roles even in the interwar period. So that by the time you got to the ghettos, for example, women were taking leading roles in education, in journalism, in social activism. And one of the famous Warsaw Ghetto archivists, Manuel Ringelblum, who initiated the secret ownership archives in the Warsaw Ghetto. And these are quite extraordinary archives, as many of you will know. This was a project created to record Jewish suffering as it was underway, as it was taking place. And Manuel Ringelblum actually said, we need to record the experiences of Jewish women because this is an important chapter, and historians will be interested in what Jewish women were forced to suffer and endure after the war. And they will also be interested in how women adapted their lives to what was taking place. And we see women running soup kitchens, we see women running secret educational initiatives, and really taking many extraordinary roles.
Talk for a moment about women as couriers and women as partisans.
So this is very, very important because particularly in Eastern Europe, where women they were more absorbed into Gentile society before the war. They had to take place in local commerce. They had relationships with Gentile women, so they were more likely to be able to speak local languages, which was very, very important when it came, for example, to passing as Aryan. So women who, so when it was needed for women to act as couriers or agents for the resistance, they often had, for example, knowledge of Polish. But I should say that this was extremely difficult. It wasn't enough to speak Polish to pass as Aryan. You had to speak Polish without the Jewish accent. You had to speak a local dialect. You had to know local religious practices. You had to have a network of non-Jewish friends. So, for example, sorry, this is skipping ahead slightly, in Warsaw, where it is thought that more people went into hiding through passing as Aryan than in any other European city, the majority of these people were women, were Jewish women. And this was partly because it was very unusual for anyone at that time who wasn't Jewish not to be circumcised. But it was also because women could fall back on their pre-war experience of knowledge of Polish, of religious customs, of networks of non-Jewish friends. But I can't stress enough that this wasn't easy. For example, the women who acted as couriers for the resistance, who took part in the smuggling networks, risked their lives to do so. I mean, the enormity of passing as Aryan, really cannot be underestimated.
Let's get into an area where you've had the courage to confront the issues. You wrote about rape and violence within genocide in general. So why don't we confront it on two levels? Tell us about rape and physical assault against women as almost a universal characteristic of genocide, and then talk about what was distinct about the assault on Jewish women, when especially there was supposed to be no interrelationship, no physical relationship between the Nazi and the Jew.
So this is a really difficult question. This is an incredibly difficult subject of research. And I should say at this point that I am backwards and forwards in my own research on this matter. So I have by no means come to a consensus or come to an understanding of the role of rape and sexual violence during the Holocaust. When I started my research, I was very much of the opinion that rape and sexual violence was not a genocidal strategy during the Holocaust. And this is, as you say, because of the fact that German soldiers were forbidden from having sex with Jewish women. But I learned two things quite quickly. One, that of course, German soldiers don't necessarily adhere to these regulations. Even in a totalitarian regime, people just dissent. And the other thing is that as you move further away from the periphery, as you move to the satellite nations, Poland, Lithuania, soldiers were less likely to adhere to particular regulations. And in these places, you find plentiful reports of sexual violence because German soldiers didn't necessarily think that by raping Jewish women, they were having sex with Jewish women. They thought of it in terms of violence. And also, any Jewish woman who was raped would be likely to be murdered. So there was a paucity of reports on this. But so there's actually quite a few, there's more reports than one would think on this subject, even though there's a taboo against it. People don't want to think about rape and sexual violence during the Holocaust. As a graduate student, many years ago, I was giving a paper about this very subject, and one of my, I would say, more established colleagues said, "I'm listening to you, and I'm just thinking, so what? Women get raped, it's terrible, but this isn't specific about genocide." And this was such a shocking thing to hear. that I was determined to find out what the relationship was between sexual violence and the Holocaust. And unfortunately, because of our increased understanding of the role of sexual violence in genocide, due to events such as Rwanda, where practically every female survivor of the genocide was a survivor of sexual violence in Yugoslavia, we have an increased understanding of the role of sexual violence in genocide, which has allowed historians of the Holocaust to broaden our understandings of what constitutes sexual violence when we think about the Holocaust. And it came as something of a ridiculous shock to myself that I've been reading testimonies of female survivors for many, many years, and I've never really conceived of, for example, the initiation process into the concentration camps as a form of sexual violence, as a form of sexualized violence. And so I think there's several things to think about this.
Well,
I think.
Sorry, let me interrupt you only to ask
Yes,
you.
please do.
That's abstract. Tell it to us
Yes.
concretely so that we can understand it, because we all know the basic elements of on the train arrival selection,
Mhm.
what I call in Texan branding and shearing,
Yes.
which is also that. We also have all heard you know, of the notion of women losing their hair to having their hair shaved and standing stark naked with men all around them. Women we have to say women and girls of all ages. But give us a little bit more of the specifics of that as a form of violation.
Okay, so
violation.
So when women arrived at the concentration camps, they were stripped naked. They were forcibly shaved. They had all areas of their body shaved. And this was, shaving that, took off chunks of their skin as it happened. This was accompanied by lewd remarks, by jeers. And they experienced and interpreted this as a form of sexual violence. They underwent hidden body searches to search for hidden valuables. Women who were menstruating were still put through these obscene procedures. And again, once they went into the camps, there are many reports of women being raped or sexually violated. What's interesting is it's often told through the lens of another person. So it's rarely from the first person. It's often a girl in my block was raped. My friend was raped, my aunt was raped. It's never told through the first person. And what's interesting, when you look at testimonies which are given in the early years in the immediate aftermath after the war, when interviewers were not so scared of asking about these questions, women were talking about these things. They often not in the first person still. They were still saying, oh yes, I witnessed these, sexual assault by proxy. I witnessed these events, not myself, but I saw these things happening. And slowly we see that these things become strained out of the historiography as researchers become increasingly squeamish about asking them. So in the immediate aftermath of the war, people were talking about this, and then suddenly it stops. And then with the Me Too movement, it's starting again. But the challenge, and I cannot say this strongly enough, the challenge for historians, and I include myself in this, is that hunch is not enough. We actually have to find documentary evidence of these things. So when I started, I couldn't necessarily find the sources, and I thought this must have taken place, but I was very nervous about reading things that were of interest to me back into the events that might not have happened. But actually, there's a wealth of documentary evidence.
Zoe, let me ask you, you spoke about historiography. Talk about the relationship of this type of research to us historians, especially before this field was developed. What was the resistance to this on the part of historians?
I think this is a really interesting question. I think partly people are uncomfortable about talking about these things in everyday life. So why should academic research be any different? People don't want to talk about these things. And particularly when it comes to the Holocaust, they think, and survivors themselves have voiced this, you know, these things are terrible, but are these things part of what we think of as the Holocaust? Do these constitute Holocaust experiences? So we've got, if you like, the historical event of the Holocaust and people's individual experiences and how they marry the two. And I think historians and other researchers have also been nervous about asking these questions. And for anyone who's interviewed survivors from the position of historians, this is difficult because we're not counselors, we're not therapists. How would you go about asking people about these terrible experiences? And you've got to be very clear of the purpose. You know, the relationship, if you like, between history and memory, the relationship between the historian's need to know or the need to include material of the historical record and the person who's actually lived through these experiences and their right to privacy, their right to decide what they don't want to talk about. And I'm always very mindful of this relationship between history and memory. And I think it's constantly reevaluating it and reinterpreting it. And if you listen to, say, you know, early interviews from the Shoah Foundation, you think actually, oh, please ask about that. And often, you know, people don't talk because they're not asked the right questions.
And by the way, and if you ask questions, you have a double role. On the one hand, you have to be compassionate, but on the other hand, you have to be willing to hear some things that shake you to the core of your being because of how difficult it is to hear them.
Absolutely, and you have to be willing to hear things, not only that you might not want to hear, that might disrupt what you already think you know. So I think we constantly have to be humble and actually think, you know, things that we hear might disrupt our theories or what we already think we know about. And if you like, it's a question of bringing the footnotes into history rather than leaving them as footnotes. A single piece of information or evidence can disrupt a long-held historical narrative. And we can also be wrong. And, you know, and this is the other thing, you know, we can go backwards and forwards in our historical writing.
So let me say two things. First of all, we want the people who are sharing this experience with us to start asking questions so we can grapple with those questions as our conversation continues. What is tell us one or two things that were the most surprising things that you came across as you were doing this research. What surprised you the most?
Let me think. I think the squeamishness of many Holocaust historians to hear about subjects such as rape and sexual violence, women's experiences of pregnancy, women's experiences of childbirth. I find this extraordinary. And I don't just mean male historians, I mean female historians as well. I mean, you know, we think we're studying the Holocaust, for goodness sake. You know, how are we still nervous talking about certain subjects? So that has been one thing. But I would say a really striking observation, which I'm now writing about, is the fact that the Holocaust didn't necessarily act as a social revolution in terms of gender roles and expectations. So despite everything people had been through, when we get to the aftermath of the war and, for example, the displaced persons camps, people were wanting to rebuild the lives they had left behind. So you had women who had been quite prominent in the partisan movement, wanting to get married, wanting to have children. So I think as a self-proclaimed feminist researcher, I have to be very careful about not always trying to find the new, the shocking, and actually paying attention to women who wanted to continue what we might see as conventional gender roles. And these women are just as important, just as radical. I think there's a tendency now, we're always trying to find something that hasn't been looked at, hasn't been discovered. And actually, it's often a question of taking seriously what we already know and trying to delve deeper into
I'm going to, because of the peculiarity of my circumstances, I'm going to turn the questioning over to Nikki Freeman, who is the education director of the Miami Memorial, the Holocaust Memorial of Miami Beach. And I'm going to drop off, but it's not for disinterest. It's only because I'm stretched in a way that I couldn't imagine when I established this. So let me hand it over to her, but let me say again, Zoe, this is the beginning of our conversations, and we're deeply grateful to you. And let me, Nikki, please continue immediately.
I look forward
so
to
much,
continuing
Michael.
our conversation.
Thank you. So I'll continue the conversation. I'm very excited about this as well because I recently finished my PhD and I did a lot of research as well on gender roles and women's experiences. So I'm excited to talk with you. I'd like you to talk a bit more about some biological functions such as menstruation and the situation of childbirth in camps and then also after the Holocaust.
So this is a subject that there's some wonderful research being undertaken at the moment. There's lots of research, well, not lots of research, there's research being undertaken on menstruation during the concentration camps, for example. There are lots of studies on menstruation and childbirth in the ghettos, where, of course, lots of doctors and other physicians were interned. And so they were, obviously interested to write about what they were observing. But of course, these studies stopped with the concentration camps. And it seems to me that there's been things that was long held, taken for granted without really thinking about. So it's been always said that women stopped menstruating soon after arrival in the concentration camps. And part of this was shock, part of this was starvation, but this didn't necessarily ring quite true to me when I thought about women were experiencing starvation in the ghettos. And actually some women did continue to menstruate, at least for a short time, in the concentration camps. And this was another source of shame. This was another source of how women were sometimes often punished for menstruation because it was seen as or interpreted as sabotage. So women were constantly punished because of their biological functions. Other women we know actually came into the concentration camps pregnant, either because their pregnancy was not yet noticeable, or because figures such as Mengele wanted to experiment on them. And there are many heartbreaking testimonies of women being forced to make terrible choices and being helped by other inmate physicians when they realized that, it was commonly interpreted as a choiceless choice. But what I think is far less, and there's reasonable literature on this now, but what is far less research is women's pregnancy in the displaced persons camps after the war, where there's this focus on the baby boom and survival in spite, which was extraordinary. But there's also, I think, a real need for more research on women's difficulties in becoming pregnant and staying pregnant, and their fear surrounding pregnancy, and their often conflicted desire to start a family, but to start a family without any female role models. And we've often partners that we didn't know very well, or only known for a few weeks. And we see many of these issues in the literature of the second generation. So I think this is something that really needs a lot more research, particularly as we're becoming more sensitized to the difficulties of rebuilding a life in the aftermath of a genocide.
And we talked about sexual violence, but I'm also thinking on the opposite end. What about love? Like, were women able to find and experience love during the Shoah?
Well, this is a really difficult question. And this is one of the things that I'm back and forth about. So, for example, in the ghettos, there's lots of stories of love, particularly in the final days of the ghettos, where young people wanted to experience everything. So, young people had sexual relationships, they fell in love quite quickly. They wanted to experience everything while they still can, as one might expect young people to do in extremity. And then there are these difficult relationships that women describe. So there's all sorts of relationships, but I'm thinking of the relationships women describe with people who hid them. So there's a woman who survived by passing cesarean, often did so with the help of a Gentile rescuer, and not surprisingly, romantic relationships developed. And these are difficult to read about. So I'm thinking of one particular testimony where it was a young girl with a much older man, and she interprets the relation, who was hiding her and her cousin, and she interprets the relationship not in terms of love, but in terms of fun. And it's quite shocking to read. So from the perspective of a feminist researcher, I'm thinking power imbalance. This man was responsible for hiding her. He could turn her out with without any notice. He was much older. He was abusing his position of power. But who am I to say this? Where she says, but this was fun. It was relief from the boredom. It made her feel she was alive. She enjoyed it, and she survived and insisted that this was the case. So it's a very difficult. What I'm talking about is the naming of other people's experiences, and similarly, there are lots of romantic relationships in the displaced persons camps, and people who fell in love with American and British liberators, for example. And again, it's difficult not to think of power imbalances, but one has to also honor the voice in the person describing their own experience.
That's really interesting. As a historian, I'm interested in what sources you're using. So how are you getting at a lot of this? You're talking about documentary evidence, but you're also using testimonies. So
what's really interesting, so I'm working with a lot of material that was written during the war, particularly in the ghettos. For obvious reasons, far less material was written in the concentration camps, but there's a wealth of information that survives the ghettos. Not all the ghettos, but ghettos such as the Warsaw Ghetto, the Ownership Archive, there's quite a lot of material, but also a lot was lost. So one's got to be aware of working with a fragmented source base. For every source that exists, countless others were never written or destroyed. So testimony that was written during the time, testimony that was written in the immediate aftermath of the war. It was a sizable amount written almost straight away after liberation. And these were often from people who were in positions of privilege in the concentration camps, political prisoners, for example, who realized that they were in a specific position to witness what had happened and needed to bear witness. And part of their will to survive was premised on the idea of one day bearing witness. And there were also quite a lot of studies in the displaced persons camps by medical students and other people who were really interested in hearing about what the survivors had gone through, and they conducted interviews and wrote letters home and talked about these things. We have this body of evidence. And then, of course, the VHA and all these oral history initiatives. And these are harder to work with in a sense because these are interviews conducted many years after the events they describe. And one of the problems of accessing these is indexing. So it's very difficult to find experiences of sexual violence. So I think, in a way, being a Holocaust historian is a bit like being a detective or working with a big jigsaw puzzle. There's loads of false leads and different types of evidence. But it's also a case, I think, of going back to evidence one's already reviewed. I realize, for example, that a memoir that I might think I know well, I don't know well at all. And reading it, 10 different times or in a space of over a time period of 10 years reveals something completely different that I missed the first time. So it's often just a case of really paying attention to what we read, really listening.
That's really interesting. I'm going to encourage people to ask some questions in the chat. We have a question from Roger. He writes, there were capos who were very violent towards prisoners, so prisoner-on-prisoner violence may have been more common than we think. Could you talk perhaps about the prisoner-on-prisoner violence that might have been happening in the camps?
That's a great question. And actually, I have just been writing about this. Someone asked me about what I thought were the last taboos of writing about the Holocaust. And I think this is one of the last taboos, particularly violence committed by Jewish prisoners against other Jewish prisoners. Often testimonies, when they do talk about violence committed by capos, they're keen to stress that it was a Polish capo, that people are keen to not talk about the Jewishness of the particular prisoner. And I think that this doesn't make sense. We know that part of the tragedy of a genocide is that people are corrupted. And some people might have been corrupt before the events, because the whole point of a genocide, if you like, is that it doesn't differentiate. The good, the bad, the criminal, the moral are all sentenced to the same fate. So the idea of people behaving in particularly noble ways, some people did, some people didn't. So I think there are many examples of appalling treatment of the capos, and there was, of course, the capo trials in Israel, but I think a lot of this material is very, very difficult to unearth, and this might be something that there really isn't much evidence about. There's lots of rumors, but little concrete evidence. So it's a great question.
How do you use rumors as a source? Like, I know historians try to grapple with that, right?
Yeah, rumor is a really interesting source, because a rumor, of course, speaks to a certain truth. You know, the fact that people believe rumors, for example, or, you know, why do they believe? You know, to believe a rumor, it has to have some credibility. So, but I think you can. I think you can use rumors, but at the same time, you know, talk about them as rumors. So the fact that they might have pointed to something that was going on, and this is important, but it's also that a rumor contains the unsayable, the unsaid, and silences. So I think rumor has to be taken seriously as a historical source. In the same way, I have a wonderful PhD student doing a thesis on humor during the Holocaust. Because the fact that people continued to tell jokes or use irony in the ghettos was also revealing of a certain truth. It was different ways of talking about difficult things, which is what a rumor is about.
We have a comment, or a question rather, in the chat. In these situations, how could there be much besides rumor?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So if we discount rumor, I mean, and this is the problem. I think that we have to be honest about the sources that we use, and we have to be honest about, you know, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, things in testimonies that aren't true. And it doesn't mean the author's lying. It just means that they didn't have all the facts as they were happening. And it doesn't mean that we discount the rest of a testimony, but it doesn't mean that we present the whole testimony of truth either. So I think these things have to be taken almost on a case-by-case basis.
Related to this, I was going to say related to this, I'm wondering, or I'm thinking of, in a lot of testimonies, Dr. Berenbaum brought up last week, the fact that women would talk about how sometimes they would mention in the camps when they would be placing some sort of white powder into people's foods, and they would say that made them stop menstruation. But is there truth to that?
No, this is a really interesting one. So in the camps, it was rumored that the Germans put bromide in the soup as part of an experiment in mass sterilization. And this was plausible. This made sense to people. So many women, at least initially, tried to eat less of the soup for fear, thinking that they could somehow mitigate the damage. And actually, this mostly proved to be a short-lived strategy. Starvation got the better of women, but again, it made women guilty. They thought, you know, what will my husband say? So they were already thinking about the consequences of their survival as these things were happening. But actually, there's little evidence or no evidence about bromide in the soup. But it was completely plausible to the women who are experiencing this. And I've spoken to female survivors who still insist on bromide in the soup.
And what do you do with that information as a historian?
Well, I'm interested in how people interpret their experiences as they happen. So my business isn't to mine testimonies for data. It's to look at how people interpret what is happening to them as they happen. And this is interesting because we all interpret things in different ways, and we interpret things in light of different information. And, what I think now, I will change in 10 years' time. And I might tell a story about my childhood now, and I might have told it very differently 20 years ago, and I'll tell it very differently again. So I think one has to take what people say seriously, but I think we have to understand, if you like, the contingencies of memory, of representation, of experience. And I think context is everything. Someone who was writing about their experiences whilst they were unfolding in the Warsaw Ghetto was writing on the basis of rumors that they couldn't verify, was writing on the basis of insufficient information. And this is in itself is revealing. This tells us something about what information was entering the ghetto and what wasn't.
Yeah. I would like to take some more questions from the audience. Does anyone have any thoughts or any questions that they would like to ask Dr. Waxman? Feel free to type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can even unmute yourself. Well, as people think of questions, I have one more question that I would like to ask you. Is there any research being done on abortion?
Yes. So there is at the moment a PhD student who I'm just trying to remember whereabouts in the US she is, who is writing a thesis about abortion during the Holocaust. I wish I could remember where she was. So maybe at Indiana. So there is someone who is, I could find this out quite easily, who is writing a thesis about this, and it will be the first full-length study of abortion. And I think that, yeah, it sounds really important. And I hope that they're also looking at abortion after the war, because again, this is one of the taboo subjects.
We have a question in the chat. Any specific information about women's camps such as Ravensbrück that you could share with us?
Yes, so Ravensbrück is a really interesting example, and there's a wealth of literature on Ravensbrück. And actually, we know that conditions in Ravensbrück were particularly savage, and the concentration guards. And this leads me to another subject, which is the representation of female concentration camp guards. And the studies of concentration camp guards, female concentration guards in Ravensbrück often seem particularly savage, particularly brutal. And again, we can't really know whether this was the reality of these women or because they were departing so significantly from their gendered roles, they're seen as more savage, they're seen as more brutal, because it's more shocking when a woman acts in these ways. And what's also interesting about Ravensbrück is that we see the relationship between political prisoners, so-called criminal prisoners, and the hierarchy even within a women's camp. So this is really interesting, as indeed at Birkenau. So a closer look at these camps really disrupts the notion of, female solidarity or women all banding together to get through. Of course, women did these things. There were the recreation of familial bonds. Women created camp families, but there were also, horrible and violent divisions based on nationality, based on religiosity, social and economic class, which we would expect. But there's a huge body of literature on Ravensbrück, which is really worth reviewing. And again, if anyone wants to get in contact with me individually, I'm very happy to provide any sources.
Thank you. Any other questions that people would like to ask?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
Wendy,
I
you
can.
can.
Yes, I've had a long history regarding the Holocaust with family and in my profession as a therapist. And I came across a most interesting situation. There was a woman who was impregnated during the Holocaust in one of the camps, and she did have that child. And the woman was eventually put into an assisted living situation. And the child was a daughter that was born. And when this daughter came to visit the mother refused to see her because she looked so much like the perpetrator that caused the pregnancy. So this situation went on and destroyed so many lives.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think that's that's a really interesting and tragic example of how the Holocaust continues and continues and continues.
Precisely.
That actually, the suffering doesn't stop with liberation. That we can see the suffering that continues in people's post-war lives.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Any other questions or comments?
I do.
Yes, please.
Whenever you've gone for speaking engagements, have there ever been people in the audience that negated that this Holocaust actually happened?
No, you mean Holocaust denial?
Yes.
Yes, no, I haven't personally experienced it. I've had comments, if you like, on the fringes of that. So I've had people who have talked about, Jews exploiting the memory of the Holocaust, or, who have questioned what they've called the narrative of Jewish victimhood, which are all, of course, questions rooted in denial. But I haven't actually had anyone specifically saying this didn't happen.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm looking. It looks like someone has their hand up. If you would like to unmute yourself, please.
I think earlier you said something to the effect of that all of the research that you have done has made you really rethink what you thought you knew. I thought that was a phenomenal comment. And I think it's something that's not just for you in doing research. I think the more we know and the more you listen to, and as time goes on, we all need to be like that, where we get something in our head, but you need to be able to let that go, because what you think you know is not necessarily what really happened. And I love that comment.
I really appreciate that. I have to say, I constantly realize how wrong I am. I mean, many areas of life, but I mean, particularly, when it comes to research. And I think, one has to say, this is what I think at the moment, but it's a constantly changing game. And otherwise, to a certain extent, why are we reading more things? Why are we going to lectures? Why are we going to seminars? It must be to try to disrupt what we already think we know. And often one can change one's whole viewpoint from something that doesn't seem that important at the time, but you think back on it and you think, actually, that's really bothering me. Why is it bothering me? Because it questions something that one's long taken for granted. So thank you for that.
I think that's a really great note to end on. And so I'd like to thank you, Dr. Waxman, again for joining us. I know it's late where you are, but we really, really appreciate this. I think this was a great conversation and some great questions. The conversation will continue next week. On next Monday, we have our final session with Dr. Michael Berenbaum and the filmmaker Julia Mintz, who is the director and filmmaker of the new documentary 4 Winters, and they'll be talking about Jewish women in resistance. So thank you again for joining us. And again, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Waxman. This is fabulous.
It's been